Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us with the British in India. A special welcome to those from different time zones, and particularly to Uther Charlton-Stevens, who is joining us from Hong Kong to talk about Anglo-India and the end of empire, the subject of his book of the same name, published last year. Uther is Anglo-Indian through his father, who grew up in Bangalore before migrating to England with his widowed mother. Uther himself grew up in Hong Kong, but spent long evenings during the school holidays listening to his grandmother's stories of life in colonial India and service with the Women's Auxiliary Corps India on the Burma front. Uther read modern history at Oxford and followed a master's in global history at the LSE with a doctorate in modern South Asian history at St. Edmund Hall, Oxford. He has taught at Oxford, LSE, and in Russia, and is currently based in Hong Kong, where it is 1:30 a.m. or later or earlier, whatever that is. So thank you very much, Uther. Anglo-India and the end of empire has been described by one reviewer as outlining in, quote, unparalleled detail the political and social circumstances of the Anglo-Indian community in India. Welcome, Uther, to inform us about the history of Anglo-India from East India Company days to empire's end. The format of tonight's talk is that Uther will talk for approximately an hour, followed by question and answer. Please type any questions you have at any point into the chat box, and I shall read them out to Uther at the end of the lecture. Welcome, Uther. The rostrum is yours.
Thank you so much, Valerie, for inviting me to speak, and thank you to everyone who's attending. And it's a great pleasure to be involved in this wonderful series of lectures, which I've listened to or watched many as we've gone through. So just to explain that the title of my book, Anglo-India, Anglo-India is a concept of an imagined space. Anglo-India is something like the Raj, but it's something which exists both in a narrower sense and in a broader sense. So the original meaning of the term Anglo-Indian was to refer to the British themselves. But by 1911, people of mixed European and British and Indian and South Asian descent had appropriated this term to themselves, and this was recognized in the census of India of 1911. So the way in which I'm using this term Anglo-India in this book is primarily focused on the Anglo-India of the mixed, the Anglo-India of people of mixed European and Indian descent. And this was a big imagined space, which, as I'll highlight in the part of the talk, extended into Burma, because Burma was part of the Indian Empire up to 1935 to 37. And you can see on the map here, which is a map of all the branches of the All India Anglo-Indian and Domiciled European Association, which includes 4 branches in Burma and 88 branches across India. This was this huge space of this conceptual Anglo-India that I'm talking about. So I have done work on the British in India and how the British class and racial and color attitudes sitting on top of the domiciled European group and the Anglo-Indian group functioned. But for this book, I principally try and bring out the Anglo-Indian story, and I'm leaving it to my next book to talk more about the British side and about what I would call the old Anglo-India, the Anglo-India of Kipling, where that term was more associated with colonial officialdom and colonial British people before 1911, so in the late 19th century. There were a lot of terms that were used to describe the mixed, including more offensive terms like half caste and other terms like East Indian, Eurasian, and Indo-Britain. So that's something that I'll also address before this community came to be known as Anglo-Indian. So now let's move into the origins of this community. Now, obviously, the largest number of British men in India over a long period of time were common soldiers. So it's almost impossible that a large number of soldiers would be stationed anywhere in the world and there be no resulting children. That's just a fact of life. But what is interesting is that there are a lot of assumptions about Anglo-Indian origins, and these have played into popular prejudices and stereotypes of the group. So within the group, it's always been very important to emphasize that the early East India Company policy was to incentivize marriages with local women, be they Indian or mixed race, Indo-Portuguese or Indo-French women. And the company actually preferred British men to marry Indian women because its primary concern at that time was not color or race, but the issue of religion and religious denomination. So Europe had been engaged in wars of religion. The European colonizing powers were either Catholic or Protestant. And of course, the fellow Protestants, the Dutch and the English, had, plenty of animosity towards one another, but there was still a degree of rivalry, specifically between Catholics and Protestants. So that comes to this quote from the Court of Directors to the President of Madras in 1687, which you can read at your leisure on the YouTube video if you want to pause it later. Then this quote tells us how the company suggested paying a pagoda, which is a gold coin, to the mother of any child who would be born of a mixed marriage between our soldiers and the native women of Fort St. George, which is, of course, in Madras, now Chennai. So you can see from this quote that that they considered that this would be a great matter to posterity, and that in order to encourage these marriages and christening of the children as Protestants, then this incentive should be introduced. So that's very important as background to the dramatic reversal of the East India Company's policy towards the mixed. So despite the focus on trying to encourage Protestantism, my own Anglo-Indian family background is Catholic, and by the late colonial period, I would say the majority of Anglo-Indians were Catholic, and that's something, the reasons for that I address in the book. You can also think of the involvement of Irish soldiers in the British Army and the efforts of the Catholic Church in competition with the Anglican Church and other Protestant denominations to offer cheaper education. And instead of converting native people through missionary work, there was a large focus by the Catholic Church on converting already Christian Anglo-Indians from Protestant denominations to Catholicism. So there are multiple reasons for that. But in the early history, according to Christopher Horse, who wrote a great book called Poor Relations, about the origins of what was then called the Eurasian group, he suggests that in the early days, most Eurasians were Protestant, and when Portuguese-sounding Eurasians entered into the British Eurasian group, like the Da Costa family or De Rosio, they had Portuguese names, but they were converts to Protestantism. So even prominent Portuguese-named mixed people in the early days were accepted into British Eurasian circles by embracing Catholicism. So here's a lovely family photo that was given to me by Susie Longstaff of her grandmother's first communion towards the end of empire, of course, because she was born in 1936 and she's a small child here. But I think also this picture is a good indication of the skin tone ranges of Anglo-Indian children, because I presume that most of the, or all of these children are also Anglo-Indian, like Susie's grandmother. So I've got a lot of long quotes and text on these slides, but I'll leave it to you to go through them at your leisure from the YouTube recording, which you can, of course, pause. This is a statement from Viscount Valentia, which signals to a lot of historians the reversal of the East India Company policy of incentivizing mixed marriages. Valentia was concerned that the increasing number of mixed children, that he offensively calls half-castes, was a huge threat, that it was the most rapidly accumulating evil of Bengal. And he pointed to Spanish America and Saint Domingo, by which he means Haiti. And the Haitian Revolution is another reason which is given for the reversal of company policy, that mulatto mixed race slaves led the rebellion in the Haitian Revolution. However, both Valentia's statement following his travels in 1802 to 1806 and the Haitian Revolution came either so late in the process of reversing company policy or after the new company policy had been established. So they can't really be said to be the causes of it, but they could also reflect the anxieties that the company had. And another argument is whether it was about money, whether it was about ensuring that posts in the East India Company's armies would be given to the children of directors and shareholders of the East India Company and relations back in Britain, and not given to the mixed race children of officers and soldiers on the spot in India. So there is this spectrum of where the majority of mixed race children were of humble origins, and they could be the children of informal liaisons and concubinage and not just formal marriages. And they would mostly be the children of soldiers. But the more famous individuals and cases often centered around elite examples, such as those discussed in Dalrymple's book, White Mughals. So here we have the Kirkpatrick children, the children of James Achilles Kirkpatrick, who was the East India Company resident in Hyderabad and who married Khair-un-Nissa under Islamic rights, and sent these two children to Britain. So the girl here, Catherine or Kitty Kirkpatrick, who also has a Mughal name, she became quite famous in England, and she married a company officer back in England. But she was also the literary muse of Thomas Carlyle, the famous Scottish thinker and writer. And her brother had a more tragic end, that he fell into a pot of some kind of hot liquid and had to have limbs amputated, and he became drug addicted, reading Coleridge's poetry, and died quite young. So he had a very tragic life. So those individual elite cases are very interesting, but of course they don't represent the majority of mixed children. And the position of children very much depended on the class of their father. So the children of officers were more likely to be sent to Britain for their education, or to live permanently, but sometimes to be educated in Britain and to come back out to India, as would be the pattern for colonial British families as well. So mainly clustering in the 1790s, there were a series of prohibitions on the employment of mixed race young men in the company's service, except as regimental musicians. And this was mainly orders from the East India Company in the 1790s, but one of these in 1786 started to try and stop mixed children being sent from India back to Britain for education. This is quite ironic, because Valentia's solution to this so-called problem was that every parent should be forced to pay the expense of sending their mixed children to England, and this would disincentivize them from having so many mixed children. But the measures were basically to restrict the ability of young mixed race men to get the education that would qualify them to enter into the company's armies and the company's service. So as a result of these prohibitions, and they were confirmed in an army order of the commander-in-chief in India in 1808, mixed race men's position rapidly deteriorated. As I will show, it wasn't the case that this ban on military service was that effective, because there were many individual mixed race men who managed to violate or overcome this barrier through connections or through their great talents. But the fact that this was in operation shifted most of the mixed race men from potential military and East India Company careers towards more humble positions as clerks. And before, there was a stereotype of the so-called Bengali Babu clerk, that when the Bengalis became literate in English in the late 19th century and they started to take over clerical positions, this stereotype emerged. But earlier in the 19th century, the majority of clerks were Eurasians. And this also had the implication that the position of boys and the position of girls of mixed race diverged, so that the girls, well into the early 19th century, were still considered to be eligible brides for East India Company soldiers and officers and tea planters and people across the social spectrum in India. So around the 1820s, one source says that there was not a single official in Calcutta who was not married to a woman of partially Indian descent. But what often happened then was that by the female line merging back into colonial British society, leaving a genetic imprint, so that, for example, Prince William and Harry have traces of Indian DNA for these reasons. Virginia Woolf was said to, Dalrymple himself says that he has a trickle of Bengali blood. That was the result of a sort of early phase of intermarriage, and the girls often at that stage merging back into the British society, so that many colonial British people would inherit some Indian DNA. But the boys being separated out and subjected to these economic prohibitions created a strong impetus for the formation of a separate mixed race group, a separate community, marked out from the British, subjected to these restrictions, and therefore increasingly likely to politically agitate for some kind of redress for these grievances. So prominent individuals who managed to overcome the company restrictions included, most famously, Colonel James Skinner, or Sikandar Sahib, who was the founder of Skinner's Horse, which is now a tank regiment in the Indian Army, and who himself paid 95,000 rupees, which was a fortune at the time, for the construction of St. James's Church in Delhi. And that remained the official church of the viceroys until another church replaced it in 1931. So he was a very powerful individual, having served the Marathas and then gone over to the British. So here is a quote from his military memoirs, complaining at his ill treatment, because he had many senior British friends like Lord Lake. But when the Governor General went home, a lot of the promises that had been made to him were immediately rescinded. So initially he and his brothers owned jagirs of land. And then, of course, it was decided that British subjects, which they were deemed to be, couldn't own these large land holdings. So they were given a lesser pension that was not of equal value, and his prospects for maintaining his horse regiment were damaged. So this is a very earnest criticism of the British, but an expression of his steadfast loyalty to Britain and the Crown. So he says that despite this ill treatment, no one can ever upbraid me with dishonoring the steel or being faithless to my salt. And finally, though I failed in gaining what I desired and deserved, that is rank, I have proved to the world that I was worthy of it by serving my king and my country as zealously and loyally as any Briton in India. Now, famous individuals like Skinner and others like William Palmer, who built up a huge banking fortune, they were very colorful individuals who were intercultural. Skinner spoke and read Persian and wrote works in Persian. So he did play this intercultural role, whereas later on, because of the tendency of many mixed race children to be raised in orphanages and to be some separated from their Indian mothers, and also the fact that Indian women, Muslim women, could marry elite British men and have their marriages accepted, but Hindu women tended to be expelled from their own caste communities and religion, whether they converted or not, by their choice of a European mate. So essentially, most of this group, the Anglo-Indians to be the Eurasians, were cut off from Indian culture to a much greater degree than these early prominent individuals like Skinner and William Palmer. So I use a wide variety of sources. This current book focuses mainly on the late colonial period, on the about 1900 to independence in 1947, but I also, of course, looking at the background, use sources from the early 19th century, such as this beautiful manuscript. Of course, reading the handwriting on some of these can be quite time-consuming. This is a petition from the group in Bombay, who were calling themselves East Indians. So there were internal debates within this group. They really strongly objected to being called half-castes. They said that this was offensive and degrading, but they were argued as to whether they should be called East Indians or Indo-Britons or Eurasians. And there were different factions that favored various different terms. And it was the East India Company officials in Madras who imposed the designation Indo-Britons in that case, because they wanted to encourage mixed people, even though some of them might be partly Portuguese or Dutch or other nationalities, not just British, to identify with Britain and English government and see themselves as part of the great venerable British oak. So the use of the term Indo-Briton is a precursor of the meaning of the term Anglo-Indian in identifying the group more strongly with England and with Britain. So I just explain in the note here that it was when the group's politics started to crystallize between 1827 and 1830, there were a series of petitions from all three company presidencies, Bengal, Bombay, and Madras, and the Bengal presidency sent a petition all the way to London with John William Ricketts, who was the son of an ensign in the engineers who had died at the siege of Seringapatam. And he testified before both houses of parliament. He had various grievances about the civic status of the mixed, and he emotively pleaded for the group to be placed upon the footing of our fathers. So this identification with Britain was the majority experience, and it was very powerful especially through the period of the Great Rebellion, or so-called mutiny of 1857 to 8, in which case the Eurasians and the Indian Christians were at risk of being slaughtered alongside the British, and the Eurasians were usually admitted into various British fortifications, and some of them fought in the mutiny. So there was a desire to overturn those East India Company prohibitions on their employment by the military, and there were a lot of petitions later on in the 19th century to admit the group into military units or to set up an Anglo-Indian regiment of some kind. And the other campaign which built up from the 1880s onwards was that Eurasian had become, by the late 19th century, the main term that was used to refer to people of mixed race. And because of various literary depictions, such as works of Rudyard Kipling, the editor of the Englishman, Stockwheeler's novella, The Crime of Color, and many other literary novelistic depictions of Eurasians, that coincided with increasing racial ideas. It's something called, which they called at the time, scientific racism, which they thought was scientific. And that later sort of blends into eugenics ideas, and it was very associated with colonial anthropology. So this racial so-called science was mixing with these literary stereotypes, which were very negative and offensive. And therefore, the term Eurasian became loaded with all this baggage, that it became viewed by members of the group as almost a racially inflected slur. And so they wanted to have their name changed to Anglo-Indian. That was both to escape from the prejudice against Eurasians and also to associate themselves more with Britishness and to blur the boundaries between themselves and the colonial British society. So that is achieved by their redesignation in the 1911 census. And it took some time amongst British people, especially back in Britain, for the name change to take hold. So you find that E.M. Forster's Passage to India still uses Eurasian to refer to the mixed and Anglo-Indian to refer to the British. But Paul Scott's use of these terms is more nuanced. You can see that Paul Scott uses all the different terms depending on which character is narrating or speaking. And that displays an awareness that you could use the term Eurasian in an offensive way, and that sometimes people would refer to the mixed as Anglo-Indian, as they wanted to be referred to, and sometimes they might be called Eurasian, and sometimes they might even go back to these insults like half-breed or half-caste. So here is the Bishop Cotton's Boys Scout Troop in Bangalore in 1930, and this gives you a sense of the sort of continuing patriotism and British alignment of this community as it continued to form into a separated group, which was below colonial British society, but very much aspired to be accepted by colonial British society. And just below, I've got a quote from an Indian member of the government explaining why, when the Dehradun school was set up as a military academy to train Indian officers in the Indian Army rather than sending them to Sandhurst, that he wanted to limit or exclude Anglo-Indian boys from admission to this school because of the prejudices of middle-class Indian parents. So this is just to highlight that there was racial and class-based prejudice from the British side, and there was a lot of imputations of illegitimacy, and that was used in order to fuel the sense that this was a sort of a group of lowly social origins. But there was also a lot of middle-class Indian prejudice. Now, Anglo-Indians could mostly ignore this for much of the Raj. They often felt themselves to be superior to Indian communities because they became increasingly associated in the late 19th and early 20th century with the railways, and they had quite responsible intermediate managing jobs, which would be quite senior and desirable from the perspective of the vast majority of people, both in India and in Britain. So if they had a middle management position on the railways, they could afford to have many servants. They were provided with railway accommodation and railway primary schools. And so they were relatively privileged compared to the average Indian. And most of the Indians they tended to interact with would be their own underlings and subordinates within the railways or their own servants. So in little enclaves like Bangalore, where they didn't really meet the educated Indian classes, the lawyers who were involved in the Congress Party, and wealthy Indians, they generally looked down upon Indians. But of course, middle-class Indians also look down in their turn on them. So here's this quote, which I think is worth reading, from Satish Ranjan Das in 1926. Indians of good family, while welcoming opportunities for their boys to mix with boys of pure English parentage dislike the idea of their mixing with Anglo-Indian boys, whose habits and manners, in their view, are not always desirable. I'm afraid they do not consider these boys to be healthy-minded. In Calcutta, in the Boy Scouts movement, it has been found necessary to have separate associations for Anglo-Indians and Indians, because Indian parents could not be induced to send their boys to Anglo-Indian troops. If there is an influx of Anglo-Indian boys into Dehradun, it will affect the number of Indians willing to send their sons to that school. So that's an interesting counterpoint, which is often left out of the story. Here's a wonderful picture which appears in the book, and which very effectively shows how in highly mixed families, as in among my father and his siblings, it's very common to have immediate siblings of different skin tones. So you can see the mother and the sisters of the Friss Brown family, who traced their descent to a Norwegian whose surname was Friss, who changed his name to Brown in order to try and be accepted into British society. And the Anglicization of names of other Europeans and Anglo-Indians and Eurasians with Portuguese names and German names was quite a common feature. So here are also the boys from the same Friss Brown family. And on the right, another portrait given to me by Shirley Gifford Pritchard, who wrote a wonderful memoir, An Anglo-Indian Childhood. She lives in California. That's her family, the Dorseys, in 1914 in their garden in the suburb of Madras. So here is a wonderful map, which I'm sure during the course of these lectures you've already seen something like this, but just to remind you how the Indian Empire looked on the map, and that up to 1935 to 7, Burma was an integral part of it, treated as an Indian province. So this is just a side note that my work is developing into making comparisons with similar mixed communities in other parts of colonial Asia. And the Anglo-Burmans were the most closely interlinked group. So they were the leader of the Anglo-Burmans, Charles Haswell Campagnac, was actually an Anglo-Indian, and many Anglo-Indians moved to Burma as a province of British India to work on the railways and for commercial logging firms and so on. And so these two groups were treated as the same class of people. They were given the same legal status. And it's curious that everyone who was mixed, whether they were partly Burmese or partly Indian by descent, was classified as Anglo-Indian up to 1935. And then after 1937, everyone who was mixed, whether they were actually Anglo-Indian or Anglo-Burman, they were all classified as Anglo-Burman. And of course, that suited the leader, Charles Haswell Campagnac, who was Anglo-Indian himself, but he was married to an Anglo-Burman. And he realized that with rising Burmese nationalism, it was important to try and rebrand his community as a separate community from Anglo-Indians in India. So that's a foreshadowing of what will happen to Anglo-Indians in Pakistan when partition happens in 1947. So, and on the right-hand side, we see a Eurasian family in Singapore. There were also, of course, the Burghers in Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka. But interestingly, and as you can see from this map, while Burma was treated as part of the Indian Empire, Ceylon was not. So actually, the Burghers had a more separate history, and to some extent, they were more intertwined with the Eurasians in Southeast Asia. So that led to some interesting political ideas that many in the group had wanted to be redesignated as Anglo-Indian, and they saw that as affirming their patriotism towards Britain and their support of the British Empire. But there were also some mainly socialist people who followed the idea of a sort of pan-Eurasianist concept, where they should keep the term Eurasian because it would allow them to make common cause with other Eurasian communities, such as Eurasians in Hong Kong and Singapore. So this is something from jumping ahead to 1956, the Eurasian Collectivist Party, based in Bangalore also. a progressive Eurasian socialist party dedicated to the Eurasian people's right to self-determination in an extraterritorial national homeland of their own. So that was an idea like Israel or Pakistan, but in this case, instead of Anglo-India, that some Anglo-Indians wanted to create in the Indian Ocean, in the Andaman Islands, or in mainland India itself, we'll come to the McCluskey Gunj case, they had an idea, well, we can have an even bigger identity by combining with other Eurasians, and there was a plan to resettle the whole community after independence in what had been German New Guinea, which was taken over by Britain. So this is another colonization scheme. So to escape from British and Indian prejudices, Ernest Timothy McCluskey dreamed of creating an Anglo-Indian colony within India, which would become a sort of autonomous state. And before it was clear what would happen with partition, the idea of a self-governing Anglo-Indian state probably seemed more plausible and attractive. And you can see on the left adverts trying to attract Anglo-Indians to come and settle in McCluskey Gunj, which I actually visited during my research, which is today in you have to get a train to reach it. The closest major city to McCluskey Gunj is Ranchi, and currently it's in modern Jabalpur, but the boundaries have changed. So that's a very remote part of India. And my Indian friends were astounded that I intended to go there because, of course, they have Naxalite, Maoist, anti-government rebels there, and they thought it was too dangerous. So while some members of the group dreamed of creating their own homeland, either within India or somewhere else in the empire, there were the mainstream of the Anglo-Indian political leadership led by Sir Henry Gidney, who focused their efforts on achieving constitutional protections for Anglo-Indians in India. So this is a cartoon that shows how the Anglo-Indian and domiciled European demands are less than the demands of the other minorities, of the Muslims and the untouchables, the Dalits or the depressed classes. And this cartoon depicts the British as being the umpires in a race, and it quite skillfully inverts the fact that the Anglo-Indians and domiciled Europeans are only around 200,000 people, a much smaller community than the other minorities, which, being such small size, would be usually a weakness in politics. But this cartoon tries to turn it into a strength by saying, well, that means we're smaller and we're more deserving of assistance. So this is the rotund Sir Henry Gidney, who attended the Round Table conferences, who had bitter arguments with Gandhi, and who became a close political ally of Dr. Ambedkar, the leader of the Dalits. And I've got a lot of colorful vignettes in the book about the political interactions between Gidney and Gandhi. And on the left-hand side, you can see him meeting with Cripps. Now, this was a very unfortunate meeting because Cripps told Gidney that there was no intention to extend the special constitutional measures for Anglo-Indians after the British left, and that the Constituent Assembly, which would draft the Indian Constitution, could not find a seat for such a small community. So Gidney was so depressed and demoralized by this that he died a few months after the meeting. And a young lawyer called Frank Anthony took over leadership. Frank Anthony would ultimately, feeling let down by the British, turn to the Indian Congress leaders for support and try and reorient the community in India to embrace Indian nationality. So he said that Anglo-Indians should consider themselves Anglo-Indians by community and Indians by nationality. But a lot of Anglo-Indians didn't really accept that idea. Some even accused him of being an Indian Christian himself, of not really being an Anglo-Indian because they disliked his pro-Indian attitudes. And so members of my own family and other Anglo-Indian waves of emigration to Australia, mine went to Britain in the 50s, were partly a rejection of Indian independence or of assimilating, and of the pressure to learn Indian languages and the fears that their children would be discriminated against in education and in employment in the future. So one of the topics signaled on the cover of the book, which I don't go into in very great detail. So I won't tell you that you can read this book and learn all of the Hollywood history of Anglo-Indians, but I do find that these cases are colorful examples of one of the main issues in the book, which is racial passing. So because we had a hierarchy of British society in India, which was very class and color and race conscious, in order to succeed in the early 20th century, Anglo-Indians, men and women, often, if they had light skin, if they were the light-skinned sibling, they would attempt to pass as either a domiciled European, which is a European of multi-generations in India who'd lost their UK domicile, or as a fully fledged British person. And they did this with varying degrees of success, and it obviously depended on their color and their ability to change their accent and behave in a way that would be credible. So very famous case, of course, she's on the cover of my book in her role as Anne Boleyn in The Private Life of Henry VIII, is Merle Oberon. So that, of course, wasn't her original name. Estelle Merle Thompson O'Brien was her original birth name, and she changed her name, as many Hollywood stars did at the time, on the advice of the studios. But in this case, it helped to conceal her Anglo-Indian background. So this enabled her to pass in London and then in Hollywood as supposedly British, although I think that we can agree when I show you some other photos that this was a thinly veiled pretense on the behalf of the Hollywood set to pretend that they believed that she was purely European. There's a famous TV series, Queenie, which some of you may have seen, and I think that the choice of the actress Mia Sara was too light-skinned and European-looking, really, to represent Merle, but it's still a great series, and of course she stars alongside Kirk Douglas. So famously, Merle was able to succeed in Hollywood and have romantic scenes with famous actors like Leslie Howard, Douglas Fairbanks, and of course here Laurence Olivier in Wuthering Heights. And her career success, unlike another famous Asian American actress, Anna May Wong, who recently got put onto the American coins, was the result of the fact that she was able to pass as being white or European, because up to the American Supreme Court ruling Loving versus Virginia in I think it was 1967, it was not possible for people of different races to marry in the US, and certainly it wasn't acceptable for much of the early 20th century to depict on-screen interracial romance or kissing. So the Hollywood Hays Code, which also was reflected in the policy of the British Board of Censors, tried to prohibit obvious interracial romance. So passing, in this case, enabled her to become a worldwide star. So she married her director. This was before Me Too, obviously, acceptable thing to do at the time. And Alexander Korda was Hungarian Jewish, and he also had a sense of how hiding one's identity could help to protect people of Jewish origins, and Jewish stars in Hollywood also like routinely had their names changed to non-Jewish sounding names. So he would have been quite familiar with that. He became a titan of British wartime propaganda, and when he was knighted, Merle became Lady Korda. Unfortunately, the marriage didn't last, and he was only one of her 4 husbands. So this is after he was knighted and she became Lady Korda. And then another interesting case which people are less likely to link with Anglo-Indians is that of Vivian Leigh. And Vivian was the daughter of a more elite British man, but he was forced to resign from his memberships in the prestigious Bengal and Saturday clubs because he married her mother, Gertrude Frances Yakchi. So Gertrude's father was an Armenian Catholic, and I don't mean an Armenian from Armenia, but from the long settled Armenian community in India. So I would say that that makes her definitely of mixed race and of partially Asian descent. So when she won the Oscar for the 1939 Gone with the Wind, she could said to be the first woman to win Best Actress who was of Asian descent, while Merle was the first to be nominated a few years earlier for The Dark Angel. And the her mother, so the grandmother of Vivian, the mother of Vivian's mother, she came from an orphanage, the kind of hill station orphanage where many of the light-skinned children were probably Anglo-Indians, were probably mixed, but her family only admit to the Armenian side of this story. They don't like to say that that she was Anglo-Indian. So it continues to cause controversy when I've discussed it on social media in recent years. So I think that it's a good point to think about how British colonial society operated above the Anglo-Indian community here, because she was in a more elite position in British colonial society, despite what happened to her father resigning those clubs. I can give you some anecdotes from the 1930s from Radcliffe Sidebottom, who was a member of the Bengal pilot service, to express what the kind of class attitudes were like at the time. So British women who came out were often referred to as the fishing fleets, that they were coming out to fish for husbands, and those who were unsuccessful and who went home without a husband were referred to as returned empties. And it was within this context that the competition between British women seeking husbands factored into the prejudices towards mixed race women who might aspire, if they were lighter skinned, to pass and to manage to marry a British man, because there was a sort of competition between the two. But the class system of the British themselves was highly gradated. It depended on which clubs you were a member of. The Bengal and the Saturday Club would be right at the top of the pile, whereas clubs like the Calcutta Swimming Club might be more in the middle, and the Rangers Club was known to have a lot of Anglo-Indian members. So Radcliffe Sidebottom talked about cases of poodle faking, which was a sort of vulgar euphemism for aggressive flirtations. And it meant possibly that you would woo some young lady without the honorable intention of getting married. And his view was that during the season in Calcutta was divided between the cold and the hot weather and the cold weather. And the British women tended to decamp up to the hill stations during the hot season, and along with some of the senior British colonial officials, while the more junior British colonial officials remained behind in the heat of the plains in their offices. So this was the time, according to Radcliffe, that he would engage in poodle faking with Anglo-Indian girls because the British women were out of the way. And to quote his, unfortunately phrased words, this was, quote, when you took out what was, I'm afraid, called the B-class girl, the Eurasians and poor whites, who he described as, quote, absolutely riddled with sex, very beautiful, and comparatively fair game. You hadn't got to marry them and they courted you. And moonlight picnics were a very common event, where one took girls out into the jungle virtually, or you drove out to some spot near the paddy fields with champagne, beer, a cold chicken, and some blankets. When canoodling with the B-class women, you were not confined to the manners of the club. You didn't have to worry about chaperones. So those kind of sentiments, unpleasant, they sort of mirror the stories about the escapades of some of the colonial memsabs when they went to the more racy hill stations like Missouri, where single young women of the fishing fleet had to be treated very carefully with chaperones and so on. But married women, unaccompanied by their husband, were often rumored, and this was very much built up in Kipling's novels, to have extensive liaisons and adulterous affairs with young men, young officers who were visiting their hill station. So of course, all kinds of generalizations like this point to some elements of truth, but they could also feed into popular prejudices. And it's not really fair to characterize any group by these kind of salacious stories, but of course, under the sun, all things go on. So if you want to have a sense of how this operated, I recommend you to read some of Kipling's short stories. His Chance in Life is one of them, but the one that addresses this kind of issue is called Kidnapped, in which a young British officer is determined to marry a girl of Portuguese complexion, or Spanish complexion, I should say, in the novel, Mrs. Virginie Soles sorry, her name is Mrs. Virginia Soles Castries, and his name is Paithrop. So if she married him, then she would become Paithrop. And Kipling describes how basically everyone ought to know that this was impossible according to the rules of the Raj for a young British man with a career and a future before him to marry a girl of Spanish complexion with a name like that. And he also makes the joke that her family had anglicized their name from De Castries. They dropped the D for administrative reasons. So I'll, without going further into that story, I recommend you to go and read some Kipling, which of course is always entertaining. Of course, the other very great work, which some of you may have read or have seen the MGM film of 1956, is Bhawani Junction. And this directly addresses the situation of the Anglo-Indian community at the end of empire. Now, the author, John Masters, was definitely a domiciled European. And according to the Anglo-Indian leader, Frank Anthony, he would have said that he was an Anglo-Indian passing as a domiciled European. Whether that's true or not, he certainly had a huge interest in the details of the community. Of course, his novel was also considered to be vulgar by Anthony and salacious, which of course is why it was popular to become a best-selling novel in the US and a Hollywood film. So the film was filmed in Pakistan because of sensitivities around its nature in India. And one interesting thing is that Ava Gardner was undoubtedly cast because she was thought to be white, but it may be the case that because she admitted later in life to having a black sister, that she was also herself mixed. Because just as is the case with the Anglo-Indian community, there are a lot of people who are descended from African Americans in the US who come in all skin complexions too. And that's an issue which is under discussed, that in the American census, you would have one part of a family living on one part of a street who are classified as being quote unquote colored in the language of the time, and people over the street, members of the same extended family, who are classified as white for the census. So those issues exist in the US context too. Of course, the big difference is that in India, there was never any prohibition against marriage. Like the Kipling story, this was just a question of social pressure, of class attitudes, of how this would affect your career. So common soldiers, tea planters could easily marry Anglo-Indian girls, and as Kipling said, no one would bat an eyelid. But that was because the British other ranks, BORs so-called, this became a kind of slur in its own right, they were regarded as so much below the colonial British society. So even below the boxwallahs and the people in trade, the people who were jute and tea garden wallahs, were the British common soldier in India, British other ranks, BORs. The Viceroy, Lady Curzon, who was of course herself American, similar to Churchill's mother, she referred to British common soldiers as less than dust. And no colonial memsahib, according to one historian, could be more contemptuous of anyone than a British common soldier or a Eurasian ticket clerk. You know, these people were right at the bottom. So because the class prejudice operated against average British Tommies out in India, therefore they, coming from working class backgrounds, often found it was attractive to marry into the Anglo-Indian community, because instead of going back to Britain, they could have some servants and get a middling job on the railways and marry a beautiful Anglo-Indian girl and settle down in India. And many British men did that during the late colonial period, but it was beneath the notice of British colonial societies because they were already looked down upon in class terms. So again, that highlights how this history is different from American racial history, because class is so much more important a factor in the British case, even in colonial settings. So in this Bhawani Junction story, it's slightly less plausible that Colonel Savage is an officer who falls for Wakai subaltern Victoria Jones. And she symbolizes the Anglo-Indian dilemma towards the end of empire by being given a choice between becoming an Indian. So she considers she dons a sari and she considers marrying a Sikh railwoman, or she considers the boy next door, the Anglo-Indian Patrick Taylor, who is full of prejudices, who has a sort of complex of adhering to the British and looking down on the Indians. So she finds him very frustrating. And Colonel Savage, who's British, who would be the traditional marrying up, the hypergamous choice. And it's interesting that between the book and the film, the outcome is different. So in the film, Savage decides to remain behind in India and to marry Victoria. And so that fixes that problem. And to get Patrick Taylor, the Anglo-Indian railwayman, out of the way, he dies a heroic death very conveniently by preventing a terrorist saboteur from blowing up a train on which Gandhi is traveling. And that fulfills the sort of typical Hollywood ending that the leading man always gets the girl. And that is also why it was important in Hollywood terms to cast Ava Gardner, who looked so white, because Stuart Granger, who plays Colonel Savage, has more of a sort of action man tan, and whatever her probable or possible mixedness, Ava Gardner has very light skin. However, in the novel, there's a different ending. In the novel, she doesn't end up with Colonel Savage. She ends up with her Anglo-Indian boy next door, Patrick Taylor, who also works on the railways, as her father is. Her father's a railway driver. So this is all very stereotypical of Anglo-Indians as a railway community. And in this case, the choice is either the natural one, because she's staying within her own community, which might be something, if John Masters was an Anglo-Indian passing as a domiciled European, that might be explicable, or it just fits with the British prejudice that really, you know, marriages between British men and Anglo-Indian women should be discouraged. So the Women's Auxiliary Corps played an important part in the Second World War, and I've written quite a lot about it, not so much in this book, but in my other articles in my first book. And of course, I was quite inspired to do all of this work by my own grandmother, who was, I'll just skip ahead, the lady in the middle of this Wakai unit in South India, Virginia Mary Stevens. Her maiden name was Devaz. And here's a more typical Wakai unit from North India. So this has the sort of more approximate balance between women wearing the sari variant of the uniform, who would tend to be Indian Christian women or other Indian community women, and women wearing the skirts, who would mostly be Anglo-Indians with one or two British female officers. So my own grandmother was quite successful in managing to become an officer in the Women's Auxiliary Corps, and she told me all these stories through childhood about life in India and her India, which was that kind of Anglo-India that somewhat relates to the picture we get from Bhawani Junction. So in another setting, she often looks lighter skin tone, but with her immediate family members, her complexion is more obviously brown, and her father was very dark-skinned. So my great-grandfather, very dark-skinned South Indian man whose surname was Devas, and my great-grandmother was alleged or asserted to be Irish, but of course she was Anglo-Indian and may have been partly Irish. This is my great uncle, George Devas, who was a doctor in the Army Medical Corps in India. When he went to Britain, he later practiced as a GP. And these are my grandparents. And of course, in this photo, you can see how my grandmother, although she was brown, especially in the black and white photo, could pass for white. And my grandfather looked European. How he identified, I don't exactly know, but he was a member of the Royal Indian Army Service Corps, which was looked down upon by British officers of more elite regiments and considered to be a unit that was full of Anglo-Indians and domiciled Europeans. On the right is a picture of him in a dress uniform, which I believe was when he was in the service of the princely state of Mysore, which is near to Bangalore. And his relative is standing on his mother's side, is standing top right in this photo from Tibet, Willoughby Patrick Rosemere, who worked for the telegraph department and was involved in a mission to Tibet to lay the telegraph line to Lhasa. So I think that I can surmise from the family stories and from the apparent complexion of Willoughby that my grandfather, though he could have passed as European or British much more easily, was also mixed. And I know that his baptismal certificate shows that the family was a railway family going back several generations in Madras. So here are two other individuals that give us a sense of how passing could work in favor of Anglo-Indians in their careers. On the left is William Pratt, who is famous to the world as Boris Karloff, famous horror Hollywood star of the early 20th century. And on the right is his brother, Sir John Pratt, of who, when he was with the British Foreign Service, serving as Consul General in Shanghai. So here are all four. Well, they had more brothers. It was quite a large family. So their father was definitely Anglo-Indian, though at the time he was classified as Eurasian, and he objected to that, and he wanted to be known as, quote unquote, an Englishman of color. And so he brought his sons up probably to think of themselves in that way, and two of them had very successful careers in the Indian civil service and the judiciary in India, and another two, including Sir John Pratt, very high-level careers in the British Foreign Service as consuls in Chinese treaty port cities. And there's Sir John on the left, and Boris Karloff to be on the right. So if I could recommend a film to you from his many horror films, one I particularly enjoyed was The Mummy over Frankenstein, because it was very atmospheric and showed his ability to emote in a relatively silent role. And Hollywood also took advantage of his ambiguous ethnic status in order to darken and lighten his skin so that he could play Native American roles and European roles, and also the yellow face eye makeup to enable him to play Fu Manchu and the more sympathetic Mr. Wong, a detective. So I will stop there and turn it back over to Valerie for questions.
Uther, thank you so much for that absolutely fascinating talk, informative and also very entertaining. Since my family were domiciled in India for almost 200 years, I listened with particular interest. Thank you also for gallantly agreeing to talk in the early hours Hong Kong time. I think it must be about 2:30 your end right now. I'm just in awe of your stamina. I hope you're up for questions. We already have a few, so I'll get straight into them. One was emailed to me very early on in the piece, and it's from a gentleman who had his early years in British India, and he writes, or rather he emails the following. In 1946, aged 10, I left Peshawar, where my very special best friends were Roger and David Ahmed, the sons of the chief vet and his British wife. I remember the racial culture was mutual respect, unlike the way things were in Southern Africa, where my family moved to. How have the likes of the Ahmed family been doing in modern Pakistan?
Am I right in thinking that in that case the mother was British and
That's
the
right.
father was Pakistani or Indian to be Pakistani? So there were a lot of cases of there were a lot in absolute terms of individual cases of Indian men who married British European or occasionally Anglo-Indian women. In fact, it seemed more common for Indian men to marry European women than to marry Anglo-Indian women, because Anglo-Indian women, their prejudices during the colonial period was to either marry within their group or preferably to marry British men if they could. Of course, there's a desire within the group's leadership to downplay the preference for British husbands, but there were very big advantages to them in those marriages, so it's not really surprising. And however, the other side of it, which I don't really talk about in this book, but which was very prevalent, was all of the marriages the other way. Now, that was always a smaller number in absolute terms than the marriages between British men and even local women towards the end of British rule. So mostly British men later in the Raj would be pressured not to marry local women. Many married Anglo-Indian women, and some married or cohabited with Indian women. But there were cases which, when you enumerate them, are many, many individual and many prominent cases, because it tended to be Indian men of higher status who had traveled to Europe who were more likely to marry European women. And sometimes they married working class women. And of course, there were all these Maharajas who often had European mistresses and occasionally wives. There's that book called Wicked Women of the Raj that deals with that topic particularly. But the sort of respectable middle-class Indian men who married European women, their families tended to not be connected with the Anglo-Indian community at all. They just managed to, they obviously came from more cosmopolitan backgrounds, so they would have braved any kind of caste considerations. And Nehru's own close family included family members one family member who had married a British woman. So the children, having their father's Indian name, tended to be more at home and more accepted within Indian society. They weren't marked out. And there's a good source in the book saying the explanation of this is, consider the difference between a Ramsey and a Ramaswamy. You know, if you're raised as a Ramaswamy, you just feel Indian like everyone else, with just a sort of distinctive sense of having some, you know, wider cultural background. But if you're a Ramsey, this Indian says, then you think you've taken on the white man's burden and you're there to represent the empire, and you constantly identify yourself with your Britishness and you downplay your Indianness. That was the perception of this Indian commentator on the difference between the two phenomenon. So certainly that issue of Indian men who married European women, if it could be brought together, because there are so many individual such cases, if they could be brought together, that would be a fascinating topic for another book.
So what you're saying is, because this gentleman's friends had an Indian surname, the boys, his schoolmates, would fare better in Pakistan post-independence than they would have otherwise. But in your book,
I mean, their problems would probably arise from being Christian if they were Christian. So the issue would be, were they Christian or not? Because if they were Muslim and they have a name like Ahmed, then I think that they would be completely fine, because of course Indian society has not just caste prejudices, and Pakistani too, but color prejudices, and lighter skins are highly valued on the marital market between different Indian communities. So, having lighter skin is not in any way a handicap in itself.
We have another question here, which is, my thanks for a fascinating talk. I wondered if Uther could talk about the relationship or lack thereof between the Anglo-Indian community and the mixed race population that the British referred to as Portuguese in the 17th and 18th centuries. Were the mixed race descendants of Portuguese colonists ever a part of the political story you are telling?
Yes, but that is quite a complicated question. And I have a particular interpretation of this, which could be different from that of some other friends of mine who are also working on this area, like Brent Otto. My view is that, which is rooted in Christopher Hawes's work, is that there was a kind of British Eurasian identity, which was the basis out of which the Anglo-Indian identity ultimately emerged, and that it could assimilate people with other European backgrounds, including Portuguese backgrounds. And of course, that mirrors my own family experience, that on my grandmother's side, our name is De Vaz, and on my grandfather's side, it was Stevens. So there are lots of Anglo-Indians, even, in the 1920s and 30s, with names like Da Costa, De Mello, Fernandez, and they were accepted into the Anglo-Indian Association and part of the community. I think that in order to be thus accepted, they had to be English-speaking and kind of enter the social world. They had to assimilate. My view is that the Anglo-Indian community became an ethnic cultural group in its own right, and it had this British English-speaking orientation and identity, and it could absorb people who are mixed, or even people who weren't mixed but who claimed to be, if they assimilated to its culture and gained social acceptance as part of the group. So I think that there are many Anglo-Indians who are partly Portuguese, but at the same time there are distinct other communities like the Goans who Anglo-Indians intermarry with. And Dorothy McMenamin's work on Goans and Anglo-Indians in Pakistan, or Anglo-Pakistanis after independence, is very interesting on this, because the Goans and the Anglo-Indians have so much in common, but the Goans have their own strong identity, and that has remained a separate identity, even though the two groups can intermarry. And Goans can be either Indians with Portuguese conversion names, or they can be people who are Luso-Indians or Indo-Portuguese people to some degree. The British were usually skeptical that a lot of the Portuguese or Luso-Indians really had very much Portuguese ancestry. There's a really great quote from a novel, an American Girl in India, I think it's called, which I quote in the book, where this writer says, well, the Portuguese must have been a masterful people because there were so few of them, and they've left behind so many descendants, or people who claim to be descendants of the Portuguese. And then the Anglo-Indian Association and its leaders like Frank Anthony, they have always drawn a firm line until recent times that people who speak Malayalam, whose first language is not English, are not Anglo-Indians, even if they're people of mixed race, and even if they fit the constitutional definition of an Anglo-Indian as being somebody with European descent in the male line. They say that it's implicit, according to Frank Anthony's logic, that English language is a marker of membership in the Anglo-Indian community. So they might, in these post-colonial times, they might accept the partly French people from Pondicherry who want to become Anglo-Indians and want to be classified that way. But they are still skeptical about people who claim to be Anglo-Indians, who want to be accepted as Anglo-Indians, who are partly Portuguese or claim to be partly Portuguese in places like Cochin, people who speak Malayalam, those communities which are very much more indigenous in their culture. You know, they have a sort of lighter imprint of European cultural influence in the view of the Anglo-Indian community and in the view of the British. So those people are not always accepted, but people who are highly anglicized and who intermix with Anglo-Indians can basically assimilate into the Anglo-Indian group. And that's been a process which I think goes back a long way and has always been taking place.
Now, another question here, Uther, is how do you see Anglo-Indian institutions like La Martiniere schools in India and Lyon evolving in an increasingly nationalistic India?
Well, the preservation of the English language in India was a big question mark after independence. You know, the pressure of from Hindi and also from linguistic states and regional languages was very strong, and there were linguistic nationalists, both the Hindi All India ones and the provincial linguistic nationalists, who were against English language education continuing. So it was actually Frank Anthony's, he was a practicing lawyer even as the Anglo-Indian leader, his role in a Bombay High Court case and at the Supreme Court of India that upheld the right of the Anglo-Indian community to maintain their own schools, and this sort of implicit attachment of Anglo-Indians to English as their mother tongue. And then he used that to claim that therefore English is an Indian language because it is the mother tongue of a recognized Indian minority community. So whether the current government respects all of these constitutional niceties and these legal cases, because you have to remember that the Indian courts and the judiciary are the other main conduit alongside the educational system and the involvement of the Anglo-Indian community in the educational system that have preserved the English language in India after independence. So those planks are really important for preserving the Anglo-Indian culture through the continuing importance of the English language. So of course, you know, most of these schools now, they cater to non-Anglo-Indians, and Anglo-Indian students, even in the Frank Anthony public schools, are a minority of the students. And therefore, it becomes a harder case to say that all Indian parents have the right to educate their children in English if they want to. The market for education is very strong in India, though. You know, all these private universities, private schools and colleges that have sprung up, you know, even in recent decades. So as long as the sort of market pressure and parental demand is there for English language education, and we've sort of passed through the period of maximalist linguistic pressure, perhaps, I'm not sure to what degree it is a priority of the current government to eliminate English language education. So perhaps if left to parents themselves, these schools have a long and distinguished future ahead of them.
Now, another question here, Uther, is you mentioned before the talk started that the sources are patchy, but better than expected. I've been told the same, that there are not really any worthwhile sources about the BORs, I suppose British other ranks, who are entwined with this story, with my own family history for that matter, and who are an aspect of subalternity that is pretty much entirely lost in the historiography, with the focus on the British in India being on the comparatively small numbers of the ICS and of the Indian Army officers. Your thoughts?
So, I mean, it is partly a product of how much material different groups leave behind. What I was saying before the start of the talk in our preliminary discussion was that there was a lot of skepticism from academics during my process of preparing to do a doctorate and the early stages of my doctorate that I would find source material. Actually, there's an abundance of source material on Anglo-Indians that I've discovered and extensively enumerated in this book and my other work. So there's no lack of source material on Anglo-Indians because Anglo-Indians were English speaking and because they were very loud and boisterous and always ready to protest and make their voices heard. So inescapably, they make it into the colonial archive all over the place once one gets a sense of where to look. So yeah, there was the skepticism that I would find the source material. The other thing I said was that, well, you know, source material that exists now may not always be preserved very well and may not survive completely into the future. And that's a concern for scholars of most historical subjects in South Asia. But I'm just guessing on the question of British other ranks that there'll be plenty of material from the perspective of the army department and from, you know, military commanders. There may be letters from individual soldiers, but, you know, they wouldn't have organized collectively in a political sense. The source material may therefore be more diffuse and fragmentary, and somebody would need to do a lot of work to collate it and bring it together and try and do what I've been trying to do for the Anglo-Indian history.
I have a question, which is, were records or censuses kept in India of who was Anglo-Indian and who was domiciled European? And was this, were these identities based on self-identification?
Well, there's multiple areas in which one could assert these different statuses. So by your participation in the census would be one arena where you would make claims about what your identity was. And your claims in relation to a jury trial, if you came into the criminal system, would be another. Your membership of certain clubs or associations. So some Anglo-Indians who wanted to pass as domiciled Europeans would seek to join the European Association. That's something I discuss. And the Anglo-Indian leadership were trying to persuade the European Association to not allow Anglo-Indians to become members because this validated their self-perception and their self-identification that they were Europeans. But the Anglo-Indian Association thought that the European Association just wanted to bolster their numerical strength and their revenue as a sort of fee-paying membership organization, even though in the case of colonial clubs, which were social organizations, Anglo-Indians would be quite strongly excluded, and domiciled Europeans would struggle to gain entry as well. So there's a case of a domiciled European called Roy Nissen that I've discussed at various times, who was of Danish paternal ancestry. So he said he had a swarthy complexion. He worked on the railways. That suggests that he's an Anglo-Indian passing as a domiciled European. But he was probably reflective of many people who identified as domiciled Europeans. And his sister managed to, who was lighter skinned and a sanatorium matron in Karachi, managed to marry a royal insurance clerk who was British and move to Calcutta and ascend up to claim to be a memsahib. So his sister passed successfully and married a British man, and not just a BOR soldier, but a sort of clerk in a company. So, you know, she did very well. He struggled as a swarthy domiciled European. He said Anglo-Indians would not call me a domiciled European. They would say I was a fair Anglo-Indian, although he called himself swarthy, so fairer than they were. And he wanted to join various clubs. He applied to various clubs, but he couldn't manage to get admitted. So he was admitted to Rangers, which was the easiest for Anglo-Indians and domiciled Europeans, but he wasn't accepted into various other clubs. And eventually, during the Second World War, when they were short of members and more desperate, they admitted him to the Calcutta Swimming Club. But he never felt that at home socially in that club, even though he had this deep desire to be accepted as European. So I think there are obviously a lot of colorful and interesting individual stories on this front. And there's also what I discuss in the book, which is the kind of the numbers game of how people defined themselves in the census and how they wanted to be included on the electoral roll and so on, because there was a separate Anglo-Indian electoral roll for certain elections. And in some contexts, like in Burma, the Europeans and the Anglo-Indians voted together. And in some other contexts, they separated out the domiciled Europeans and the Anglo-Indians for voting purposes. So, you know, this was variable.
And of course, they were all called Anglo-Indians in Kipling's day, and they didn't differentiate between them. You mentioned that Anglo-Indians were fairly assertive. They were boisterous people. So does that mean that Anglo-Indian culture was different to British culture in India or to domiciled European culture, if there were such things?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, I think some of the social mores and dress codes are within the Anglo-Indian community. That's an interesting aspect, which is that because we have all these stereotypes in fiction and in various prejudices that Anglo-Indians were sort of highly sexualized, especially Anglo-Indian women, because many of them would have liked to have married European men. So that leads to quite unfair depictions, because I think when you look at British colonial society, generally speaking, its social mores, its attitudes to women were at least a generation behind what was happening in Britain. And I think that the Anglo-Indian community in turn was, you know, at least a generation or half behind the colonial British society in India. So they were often clinging on to sort of late Victorian values, and they were quite strict about chaperoning girls and not leaving them unattended. You know, from an Indian point of view, women and men dancing and drinking together at parties is scandalous enough. But within the Anglo-Indian community, they were more fastidious in the 1910s and 1920s about how young women should be chaperoned than the British were. So I would say that the social values were often slightly antiquated, and the dress was often slightly antiquated. So, you know, the stereotypical Anglo-Indian woman wearing a frock, and the sort of persistence with certain forms of dress. It's because these are kind of cultures that are linked to Britain, but don't change as rapidly, and they sort of become a bit ossified in the colonial setting. So that's just dress and you know, sort of social mores. That's just one aspect of this. But I would just say from personal family experience, Anglo-Indians are much more of a vivacious people than the British. You know, the stereotype of the British is a certain kind of stiff upper lip and a certain kind of reserve. You know, Anglo-Indians, when they moved to Britain, often found people to be cold and not so warm. And that wasn't just racial or color prejudice. It was also just this sort of hail fellow, well-met, gregarious Anglo-Indian culture that they were used to was not similar to the more reserved manner of behaving in Britain. So, you know, my personal feeling off the record is that Anglo-Indian culture has a sort of slightly more Mediterranean energy than a sort of northern, you know, cold climate reserved energy.
So many questions, Uther. You've had more questions than any speaker we've ever had. And I haven't had to wheel out some of my in reserve questions either. One question here is, what are the economic circumstances of the Anglo-Indian community in India nowadays? Are they discriminated against?
It's a very complicated issue, because I think that in many ways, before the rise of the current Indian government, Anglo-Indians went through a very difficult phase after independence, and that led to waves of emigration to Britain and Australia, to a lesser extent Canada and New Zealand, and a trickle to the US. And that was a period when they were under sort of maximum pressure on various fronts, and when I think there was a lot of employment prejudice. But in some ways, up to about the sort of 90s, India was moving in a more cosmopolitan direction. And so Anglo-Indian culture was becoming more in line just by default with middle-class Indian culture. You know, there was a sort of convergence so that modern young Indians and Anglo-Indians had more in common than they had in the 1950s and 60s. But the current government's attitude to religious minorities is stark, and therefore it can introduce new forms of discrimination which are distinct than the sort of social patterns that seem to have been taking place you know, towards the end of the 20th century. I would say that India was becoming, you know, more of a hospitable home for the Anglo-Indians by default towards the end of the 20th century. But now that with the other religious minorities, they sort of share the sort of fears and anxieties that are brought about by the sort of Hindutva ideology.
Well, Uther, rather than trot out my prepared platitudes, I'm just going to quote from a couple of tributes that people have written in the chat box. The first is hugely interesting. Thank you so much. And the second is, no questions, but a thank you from us. I am watching with my Anglo-Indian mother who grew up as a child in Calcutta and left in 1967 to move to England, and we have enjoyed hearing about our history. Our family is scattered in England and Australia, and hearing you speak so articulately about our history was fantastic. So that's a tribute from two very appreciative members of your audience. So let me just remind everyone that Uther has drawn in his talk on much more very interesting material that is in his book, which his generous publishers, Hearst Publishers, have offered to attendees of this lecture at a 25% off price of £18.75. So normally it would be £25 in the shop, but if you buy it off the publisher's website, they will send it to you. I think that includes postage too, for £18.75. So if you've enjoyed Uther's talk, I'm sure you will enjoy his book. So Uther, you've done the most remarkable job of managing to keep speaking while probably dead on your feet, but not appearing to be so. So thank you very much for a fantastic talk, which people have just loved, just judging by the questions, and there are more that I haven't got on to. And of course, I'll be emailing out the link to the recording once it's loaded onto YouTube in a day or two, and everyone will have the chance to revisit your talk, as so many people do, and savor it in their own time. So thank you very much, Uther. It's been a marvelous talk and really hugely enjoyable. So good night, Uther, and
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you very much for having me.
Night. Oh, this is the last of the talks in our series, but we'll be recommencing in October, and we'll send you MailChimp emails telling you what our next series is going to incorporate. So goodbye, everyone, and goodbye, Uther.
Goodbye.